Thunder only happens when it's raining. Players only love you when they're playing. Women, they will come and they will go. When the rain washes you clean, you'll know. One of the songs of my childhood. I was 7 years old in the back seat of the Plymouth Valari station wagon. My dad driving north on I-5 from Fort Lewis, up through Tacoma to the smaller highway that led to my uncle's house in Puyallup. My mother sat in the passenger seat. I sat behind her. We were listening to AM radio. Raindrops splattered against my window as Fleetwood Mac's musical magic wafted over me. My father was not drunk while driving us on this trip, so I could relax as long as I kept quiet and small. I wedged myself against the car door and stared out the window. As we zipped along, I noticed that when I softened my eyes, I saw impressions of trees, but when I focused on one tree, time slowed down, making it possible to quickly count the long, thin branches that bounced in the wind. One of my earliest memories is watching groups of evergreen trees sway together, the tops of each one dancing in the wind, bending back and forth to music that only they could detect. I was 4 years old, and on that day, a bird had pooped on the crown of my head. I felt the warmth on that point where the plates of my skull had fused. I reached a hand up, patting my chubby little fingers in the small puddle. Pulling my hand back down, I showed my mother that I had been anointed by a neighborhood crow, one of the many who stood watch from nearby branches and power lines. She laughed. She did not understand the language of trees or birds. Thinking that she was laughing at me, I cried. Later on, I understood that I was washed clean, not by rain, but by poop. At 7 years old, the notes and syllables of this Fleetwood Mac song cemented themselves in my cells. It was the first time that I consciously remember taking in lyrics, realizing that songs told stories and contained messages and gave warnings. Music and trees and rain, quenching a growing thirst for meaning that I didn't yet know how to articulate. It was about the same time in my life that the recurring dream began. I was in a car on a remote road lined with evergreens, a verdant corridor edged with fog, thick and dense and ominous. A tall evergreen had fallen across the road, landing on the car, caving in the roof. Glass and metal glinted in the twilight. I was alone. I was alive. I stood outside the car, on the road, wet from rain, looking at the damage. I was unhurt. Even at 7 years of age, and then as years passed by, but the dream remained, I knew that somehow this dream was meaningful. Unlike Stevie Nicks, I kept my visions to myself. I've lived in the Pacific Northwest most of my life, off and on. I've been down a lot of winding, wet roads lined with evergreens, both as a driver and a passenger. I used to hold my breath on these roads, but as I've grown, my brain has wrapped around this recurring dream, and I feel protected. Dreams nowadays are those I like to sell, not dreams of loneliness, but of connection, changing the world with my words, being seen and heard. I recently felt seen and heard at a writing retreat, where I talked about some of the frustrations of being only in the third year of growing and maintaining a small business in mental health. One lady sat across the table from me and slightly to my left. She put down her fork, waited until she held my gaze with her own, and said, "You need to raise your prices. Know your worth." I felt punched in the gut, in a good way. Struggling to get my breath back, I wanted to rally with a bunch of excuses that flooded my brain. I didn't. I felt more than seen, and I was trying to figure out what this sensation was called. I felt mothered, or what I imagine it feels like to be mothered, like a nature documentary in which a mama animal smacks her kid in order to teach the little one something important, like don't play with the snake. Stay away from that colorful, venomous spider. Know your worth. I pretend to know my worth. I'm good at pretending and projecting, but I don't, not really. I no longer say I'm sorry for taking up space, but sometimes my whole body seeps of apology, like a spongy water table that can no longer absorb the rain. Do I want to do this? Of course not. Wherever I lay my head down for the night to sleep, I prefer the bed to be by the window, where I can watch the tops of the trees swaying. Sometimes rain pelts the windows and branches bend toward and away from each other, a visual lullaby. The night when she said, "Know your worth," I stared through the raindrops hanging on the window, and I told the trees, "I don't know my worth." "What will you do about it?" they asked. "First, I will remember," I said. I began to remember in flashes like an old film strip, and I realized that I have had very little experience with feeling worthy or worthwhile through the course of my life. Perhaps no experience. Thunder only happens when it's raining. As a child, I was a thing to be used and abused. My worth was in how perfect I could project being, how small and quiet and compliant I was, and in my most authentic self, I am none of these things. When I began going to church in my teen years, I was repeatedly told that I was not worthy, that I was evil unless I gave my autonomy to Jesus and God, that I could not trust myself, that I would fall forever short, a foundation of shame. Players only love you when they're playing. In my first marriage, I tied myself to someone who was not emotionally available and often physically absent. My experience was that I needed to work for love, his love, God's love, anyone's love, to prove my value and my worth. Women, they will come and they will go. As a teacher, my worth was tied up in how the students behaved and how successfully they could take state tests on the computer ultimately, and not the community that we built, the safety that we created, or how well we learned altogether. In marriage and church and career, the message was to give selflessly and until spent and exhausted, because our worth comes from outside of ourselves and what we can do, and we definitely do not deserve compensation, validation, or appreciation. When the rain washes you clean, you'll know. Know your worth, she told me. How? I asked the trees and the birds and the rain. Root into your dense, rich earth. Connect to ancient wisdom underneath your feet. Stand tall and proud toward the light. Expand your branches underneath skies of all kinds. Bend and sway and dance and fly. Shelter yourself and others in safety, and in the rain, be washed clean.